The order was given in a room that smelled of beeswax and old money, a scent that always stuck in Constance Ingram's throat. Her aunt, Lady Arabella Farrow, smiled a thin, satisfied line. "My niece is most proficient with ledgers and lists, Your Grace. A mind for detail. She will see to the matter of the little Barton tenancies with utmost efficiency." The words were a recommendation. The tone was a dismissal. Constance was a tool, a useful instrument to be offered up. She stood by the window, her hands clasped behind her back, her gray dress the color of a winter sky. She did not look at the man seated before the grand fireplace, the source of the room's oppressive heat. She had learned long ago that meeting the eyes of the powerful was an invitation they rarely welcomed. Duncan, Duke of Kestrel Chase, did not reply to Lady Farrow. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Miss Ingram." It was not a question. It was a summons. Slowly, Constance turned. He was as the county whispers described him, a man carved from granite and grief. His hair was dark, his face set in lines of grim authority that spoke of battlefields and loss. He had been a ghost in his own home for a decade, and his return was less a homecoming than an occupation. His eyes, a startling pale gray, were fixed on her. "Your aunt says you are efficient. I require efficiency. My steward, Mr. Garrick, informs me the tenants of Little Barton are 3 seasons in arrears, and the cottages are a blight upon the estate. They are to be cleared. You will draw up the notices. You will document every soul. You will prepare the eviction rolls. There will be no exceptions." Each word was a hammer blow. Clear them, every soul. The families she knew from her walks, the children who played by the river, the old women who tended their small gardens. She thought of the Webbs with their newborn twin boys. She thought of old Tam, who mended nets and told stories of the river. And she thought of the quiet dignity with which they endured their poverty. Her own life was a study in quiet endurance, a long, gray corridor of servitude to her aunt since her father's death had left her penniless. She was a poor relation, a fact Lady Farrow never failed to underscore with every menial task and public slight. This task, however, was not menial. It was monstrous. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, but her expression remained placid, her hands steady. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They only gave people like her aunt another weapon to use against you. "I understand, Your Grace," she said, her voice even. He watched her, his gaze unwavering. It was not a cruel gaze. It was something far more unnerving. It was entirely empty of feeling, as if he were ordering the felling of a stand of timber, not the destruction of a community. "You will begin tomorrow," he stated, then turned his attention to the papers on the table beside him. The audience concluded. Constance was a ledger, a list, a thing to be used. And as she curtsied and left the stifling room, she felt the weight of every name she would soon be forced to write down, each one a nail in a coffin she was being ordered to build. The next morning, a carriage collected her. Kestrel Chase loomed at the end of the long drive, its stone facade more fortress than home. It was a place that had forgotten how to live, its windows like vacant eyes, its gardens overgrown with sorrowful weeds. Inside, the great hall was a cavern of cold air and dust motes dancing in the thin sunlight. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Holloway, showed her to a small, chilly room adjacent to the main library. "The estate office," she announced, her tone implying it was a place of little importance. It was filled with towering stacks of leather-bound ledgers, deed boxes tied with rotting string, and maps yellowed with age. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten ink. This, then, was to be her prison. Mr. Garrick, the Duke's steward, arrived shortly after. He was a man whose waistcoat was a little too tight, his smile a little too broad. He smelled of brandy and self-satisfaction. "Ah, Miss Ingram," he boomed, rubbing his hands together. "Ready to bring some order to this chaos? The Duke is a man of action, you see. No time for sentiment. These tenants have been a drain on the estate for generations. It's time for a clean slate." He gestured to a large empty ledger on the desk. "You will begin here. A full accounting. Names, ages, rents owed. I have the preliminary lists." He slapped a sheaf of papers onto the desk. "Work swiftly. The Duke does not appreciate delay." Constance simply nodded, her gaze falling to the papers. The top sheet read, "The Barton Clearances." It was a term for war, for disease, not for homes. She set to work, her movements precise and economical. She sharpened a quill. She mixed fresh ink. She opened the ledger, the clean white pages a stark contrast to the grimness of her task. As she began to transcribe the names from Garrick's list, a strange calm settled over her. This was what she was good at, finding order, creating clarity from chaos. It was the legacy of her father, the gentle, unworldly scholar who had taught her the beauty of a well-kept archive, the power of a documented fact. He had left her nothing but his books and his belief that truth, if properly recorded, could not be erased. Lady Farrow saw this skill as a useful parlor trick, a way for a plain girl to earn her keep. But for Constance, it was a shield. Her meticulous records, her perfect script, her unwavering memory, they were the armor she wore against the world's casual cruelty. She would do this job as she did all others, perfectly. She would record every name, every child, every shilling owed. She would give the Duke the efficiency he demanded. But as her quill scratched across the page, forming the name Thomas Webb, father of two, she made a silent, secret vow. She would also see everything. She would be a perfect witness. She would remember. Days bled into weeks. Constance lived within the cold stone walls of Kestrel Chase, a ghost among ghosts. She saw the Duke only in passing, a tall, dark figure crossing the hall, or a silhouette in the library window late at night. He never spoke to her. He never acknowledged her presence beyond a curt nod. It was as if she were another piece of furniture, a functional object that performed its duty in silence. Her world shrank to the dusty confines of the estate office. She worked from dawn until the candles guttered, fueled by weak tea and dry bread left on a tray outside her door by the silent Mrs. Holloway. The work was a kind of penance. She read through decades of rent books, tenancy agreements, and estate correspondence. She learned the histories of the little Barton families not as lines in a ledger, but as threads in a tapestry. She saw the births and deaths, the marriages, the hard-won battles against flood and famine, all recorded in the dry, spidery script of long-dead stewards. She saw patterns Garrick's cursory lists had ignored. She saw rents mysteriously raised, agreements altered, and maintenance requests left unanswered for years. A quiet, methodical neglect seemed to have settled over the estate, long before the Duke's return. One evening, deep in her work,
she found a discrepancy. A note in the margin of a ledger from 40 years prior mentioned a payment not of coin, but of labor. The Barton men for the annual clearing of the river weir, as per the charter. Charter? She'd seen no charter. She searched the catalog of estate documents. There were deeds, wills, land grants by the dozen, but no document with that title. She made a small, neat note on a separate sheet of paper and set it aside. It was a loose thread, and her father had taught her that loose threads, when pulled, could unravel entire coats.
Her isolation was broken by an unexpected visitor. Her cousin, Felicity, arrived in a flurry of pink silk and agitation, sent by Lady Farrow to check on her. "Constance, it's dreadful here," she whispered, clutching a perfumed handkerchief to her nose. "It's so cold, and the Duke, he looked right through me. Aunt is furious you haven't made more of an impression. She said you were to be useful." Constance continued to write, her hand never faltering. "I am being useful." "But you're just a clerk. Aunt hoped you might, well, you know. He is a duke, after all, even if he is a gloomy one. Mr. Garrick says the Duke finds you suitably plain for the task, unlikely to cause a fuss." The casual cruelty of the remark was meant to sting, but Constance felt only a weary resignation. It was what they all thought. She was plain. She was quiet. She was harmless. And in their underestimation lay her only freedom. That night, unable to sleep, she was drawn to the main library. It was a magnificent 2-story room, but it was dying. Books lay in disordered piles, their spines cracked. A film of dust lay over everything. The air was stale with disuse. This had been the heart of the house once. Now it was a tomb for forgotten words. On impulse, she picked up a book, ran a cloth over its cover, and placed it back on a shelf in its correct position. Then another. And another. She worked for an hour, a quiet, methodical battle against decay. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned, her heart lurching. The Duke stood in the doorway, a decanter of brandy in his hand. He was in his shirt sleeves, his expression unreadable in the dim light. She expected a reprimand, an order to return to her room. Instead, he just watched her, his pale eyes following the movement of her hands as she straightened a row of books. He said nothing. After a long moment, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the silence. But something had shifted. A silent exchange had occurred. He had seen her, not as a clerk, not as a functionary, but as a woman trying to mend something broken. The next day there was a second cup and a small pot of tea on her morning tray. When she glanced at Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal, an acknowledgement, a crack of light in the long gray corridor. Constance felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. It was the first flicker of hope. She turned her attention back to the ledgers with renewed focus, the memory of the Duke's silent watchfulness giving her a strange sort of courage. She began to cross-reference Garrick's lists with the older estate records, and the picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. The arrears, he claimed, were crippling the tenants, were, in many cases, fabrications, the result of his own exorbitant fees and penalties added over the years of the Duke's absence. He had been systematically indebting them, creating the very crisis he now proposed to solve with their eviction. He was not just a steward, he was a predator. And he was using the Duke's grief and detachment as a shield for his own greed. Her search for the mysterious charter became more urgent. She spent her evenings in the archives, a cavernous, stone-floored room in the belly of the house. It was a labyrinth of paper, a forgotten history of Kestrel Chase. She worked by the light of a single oil lamp, the small flame pushing back against an ocean of darkness. One night, she was so engrossed in a crumbling deed box that she did not hear him enter. "You work late, Miss Ingram." His voice startled her. He stood a few feet away, holding a lamp of his own. The golden light softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a weariness that went bone deep. "There is much to review, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Garrick tells me the matter is straightforward." "Mr. Garrick is mistaken," she said, her words simple and direct.
She did not elaborate. She did not accuse. She simply stated a fact. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest in his impassive eyes. He walked closer, his gaze falling on the ancient, dusty documents spread across the table. "Show me." It was an order, but it was also an invitation. For the next hour, in the cold, silent heart of his ancestral home, Constance Ingram, the plain, invisible clerk, showed the Duke the truth of his own estate. She pointed to the altered entries, the duplicate fees, the escalating rents that bore no relation to the original tenancy agreements. She spoke quietly, without emotion, her finger tracing the path of Garrick's deceit through the years. She presented evidence, not opinion. He listened in complete silence, his expression unreadable. He did not question her findings. He did not defend his steward. He simply absorbed the information, his jaw tightening with every new revelation. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them. "You believe Garrick has been robbing me," he said, his voice flat. "And my tenants." It was not a question. "The ledgers suggest it, Your Grace." "Why have you not brought this to me before?" "I was hired to compile a list for their eviction," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Not to offer my counsel. I needed to be certain of the facts." He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than emptiness in his eyes. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. "You have a mind like a lawyer, Miss Ingram." "My father was a historian, Your Grace. He believed in primary sources." He gave a short, sharp nod. "Continue your work, all of it, and report any further discrepancies directly to me." He turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving his lamp on the table. The twin flames burned brightly in the darkness, and for the first time since arriving at Kestrel Chase, Constance did not feel entirely alone. Her quiet acts of competence had started a slow thaw in the frozen heart of the house. The library began to shed its dusty shroud as she spent an hour there each evening, a ritual the Duke now sometimes observed from the doorway, never speaking, but always watching. Mrs. Holloway began speaking to her in full sentences, asking if the tea was to her liking, if the fire in her room was drawing well. She learned that the housekeeper had served the Duke's family since she was a girl, and her loyalty was as fierce and unyielding as the local granite. One afternoon, Mrs. Holloway found Constance staring out at the rain-swept grounds. "He was not always like this, you know," the old woman said, her voice softer than Constance had ever heard it. "Before the war, before his duchess, this house was full of light. He has forgotten, or perhaps he has not been given a reason to remember." The words hung in the air, a quiet plea. The change did not go unnoticed by Oswald Garrick. He began to appear in the estate office more frequently, his jovial manner barely concealing a new, watchful anxiety. He saw the Duke speaking to Constance, saw the way his master's gaze would follow her. He sensed his perfect, profitable arrangement beginning to crumble. His methods of opposition shifted from dismissal to sabotage. He began to question her work, planting small errors in the documents he gave her, which she would then calmly and quietly correct. He started whispering in the ears of the other staff, suggesting Miss Ingram was overstepping her station, that she had fanciful ideas, that her sympathies for the tenants were clouding her judgment. He was laying a foundation of doubt, brick by poisonous brick. The conflict escalated when Lady Farrow arrived, unannounced, demanding an audience with the Duke. She found him in the library, where Constance was carefully repairing the spine of a book. "Your Grace," Arabella began, her voice dripping with false concern. "I feel it is my duty to warn you."
My niece, Constance. She has always been a sentimental girl. Her father filled her head with romantic notions. She can be unreliable. To entrust her with such a serious estate matter, without supervision, it is a risk. The Duke looked from Lady Farrow's painted smile to Constance's focused, steady hands. "Miss Ingram's work has been exemplary," he said, his voice clipped. "Her findings are based on fact, not sentiment." Lady Farrow's smile tightened. "Of course. But a woman's tender heart can be so easily swayed. The tenants are, I am sure, filling her ears with all manner of pitiful stories." "The only stories Miss Ingram has shared with me," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "are those written in your own account books, Garrick." He had entered the library behind her, his presence instantly commanding the room. Garrick paled. Lady Farrow, for once, was speechless. The battle lines had been drawn. It was no longer about efficiency. It was about truth. And Constance was standing directly in the crossfire. Garrick, now desperate, devised a more direct attack. He knew the Duke's history, the betrayal by his late wife that had shattered his trust and sent him away to war. He would use the Duke's own wounds against him. He waited for a day when he knew Constance would be in the village, delivering some papers to the vicar. He slipped into her small room at Kestrel Chase. It was as sparse and neat as the woman herself. On the simple writing desk sat a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a kestrel. He ignored it. His target was the locked rosewood box where she kept her personal papers. A simple tool forced the lock. Inside, he found only a few letters from her late father and some dried flowers. It was not enough. So he would create what he could not find. He sat at her desk and, using a spare sheet of her paper and ink, he carefully forged a letter. The script was a passable imitation of her elegant hand. The letter was addressed to Thomas Webb, the tenant spokesman, and it spoke of a plan. It promised delays and spoke of a reward for her efforts, a sum of £50 to be paid upon the successful halt of the evictions. It was crude, but in the right light, to a man already primed for betrayal, he believed it would be devastatingly effective. He tucked the letter back into the box, relocked it, and left, a thin, triumphant smile on his lips. He had planted the seed. Now he just had to wait for the Duke to find it. The discovery came 2 days later. The Duke summoned Constance to his study. It was a stark, masculine room, dominated by a large desk and portraits of his ancestors. He did not ask her to sit. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the bleak winter landscape. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of cold fury. In his hand, he held the forged letter. "A tenant brought this to Garrick," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. "It was found, apparently, dropped on the path to the village. Garrick, in his diligence, recognized your handwriting." He held it out to her. Constance took the paper,
her fingers surprisingly steady. She read the damning words. She saw the clumsy imitation of her own script, the ugly sentiments attributed to her. It was a declaration of war, and she was its intended casualty. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her composure. This was the moment. The culmination of all of Garrick's whispers, all of her aunt's slights. They believed she would break. They believed she would weep, protest, and in her hysteria, condemn herself. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She looked up from the letter and met the Duke's icy gaze. "Explain this," he commanded. The words were a shard of ice. Her reply was quiet, calm, and absolute. "That is not my handwriting," she stated. "It is a forgery." "It looks a great deal like it." "Look closer, Your Grace."
The loop of the G is too wide. The cross of the T is too heavy. My hand is lighter. She spoke with the dispassionate authority of an expert witness. You have weeks of my work in your office. You have ledgers filled with my script. I invite you to compare them. You will find this letter is a lie. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show fear. She was offering him a choice. He could believe the ugly story this paper told, a story that confirmed his darkest views of human nature. Or he could believe in the evidence of his own eyes, in the quiet, consistent integrity she had shown him day after day. 1 second. 2. 3. The silence in the room was a living thing. He snatched the letter from her hand and strode to the desk. He pulled open a drawer and removed the ledger she had completed just that morning. He laid the two documents side by side. His eyes, sharp and analytical, moved back and forth between the forged letter and the neat, precise columns of her true script. A brief interlude from the Duke's perspective. Duncan stood at the desk, the scent of her lavender soap a faint, maddening presence on the forged paper. He saw it instantly. The clumsiness. The forger had captured the style, but not the substance. Her real script flowed with an unconscious grace and consistency, born of thousands of hours of practice. The forgery was studied, its strokes too deliberate, too heavy-handed. As she had said, the G was too wide, the T was too heavy. Garrick had underestimated her. He had assumed she was just another hysterical female, easily disposed of. But he had also, and more foolishly, underestimated him. Duncan was a man who had led soldiers into battle. He knew how to read a map, how to spot a lie, how to discern the difference between a feint and a full assault. This was a clumsy, desperate feint. He looked up at Constance. She hadn't moved. Her hands were clasped at her waist, her chin was up, her expression was one of quiet, unwavering resolve. She was not afraid of the truth. In that moment, the ice that had encased his heart for a decade cracked. He had been betrayed before, by a woman who had used smiles and tears and practiced charm to deceive him. Constance Ingram used none of those things. She used ledgers. She used facts. She used the truth as both her shield and her sword. He had thought her plain, a useful tool. He saw now that he had been a blind fool. Her plainness was clarity. Her quietness was strength. He folded the forged letter and slid it into his coat pocket. "Thank you, Miss Ingram," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "You have answered plainly. That will be all." He did not apologize. He did not explain. But as she left the room, he knew, with the certainty of a commander sighting the true battlefield,
that the war for Kestrel Chase had just begun, and he had finally chosen a side. The Duke's summons arrived the following week. It was a public notice, posted in Little Barton and delivered to the surrounding gentry. All tenants of the Barton cottages were to assemble in the village hall in 3 days' time. The Duke of Kestrel Chase would deliver his final decision regarding the clearances. A separate personal note was delivered to Lady Farrow and another to Lady Theodosia Beaumont, the county's most formidable magistrate, a woman whose mind was said to be as sharp as a barrister's. A mood of grim finality settled over the village. They began to pack their meager belongings, their faces etched with the quiet despair of the defeated. Lady Farrow was triumphant, preening herself for the public spectacle of her niece's final humiliation. She assumed Constance had been exposed, and this meeting was the formality of her dismissal and the tenant's doom. Constance, however, spent the 3 days in the archives, working with a quiet, feverish intensity. The Duke had given her one simple instruction: find it. And so she searched for the Barton Charter.
She followed the trail of marginalia back through a century of paperwork. She traced the reference from a steward's letter to a bill of sale for a neighboring property, and from there to a dusty probate inventory from the reign of the Second George. The inventory listed, among other things, one iron-strapped deed box containing the village charters. But the box itself was gone, not seen in the archives for at least 50 years. She was at a dead end. On the final evening, exhausted and close to despair, she sat in the estate office, the small wooden kestrel in her hand. Her father had carved it for her, telling her that the kestrel was a patient hunter, that it could see what others missed. She looked around the room, at the towering shelves, the neatly stacked boxes, and then she saw it. Not a box, but a space. A section of wall behind a row of lesser-used ledgers that was paneled in a different, darker wood. A hidden cupboard. Her heart began to race. With Mrs. Holloway's help, she moved the heavy books. The paneling was stiff, but it gave way to reveal a dark, cobwebbed cavity. And inside, covered in a thick blanket of dust, was a small, iron-strapped box. It was not locked. Her hands trembling, Constance lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, large sheet of parchment, its ink faded but still legible, its wax seal, though cracked, still intact. The heading was written in the elaborate script of the 15th century. It read, "The Charter of the Free Tenancies of Barton by the River." The village hall was packed. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and fear. The tenants stood huddled together on one side, their faces pale. On the other side sat the gentry, including a smug Lady Farrow and a nervous-looking Oswald Garrick. At the front, on a raised platform, sat the Duke, impassive and grim, with Lady Beaumont beside him, her expression shrewd and watchful. Constance stood to one side, holding a simple portfolio. The Duke rose. A hush fell over the room. "I have called you here to resolve the matter of the Barton tenancies," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "For many years, this estate has been managed on the assumption that these cottages are held at my pleasure, that the rents are owed, and that I have the right to remove those who cannot pay." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of the tenants. "My steward, Mr. Garrick, has advised me that the most profitable course of action is to clear the land." Garrick puffed out his chest. Lady Farrow shot a triumphant glance at Constance. "However," the Duke continued, his voice hardening. New evidence has come to my light. Evidence that suggests Mr. Garrick's advice is based not on the estate's profit, but on his own. He turned his cold gaze on the steward. Evidence of fraudulent accounting, of illegal fees, and of systematic extortion of my tenants for his own enrichment. A collective gasp went through the room. Garrick leaped to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. Your Grace, this is slander, an outrage. It is the word of a hysterical, sentimental woman against mine. It is not her word, the Duke said, his voice like cracking ice. It is the word of these ledgers. He gestured to a stack of account books a footman had placed on the table. Every entry documented, every discrepancy noted. By Miss Ingram. He then pulled the forged letter from his pocket. And it is the evidence of this clumsy forgery, an attempt to discredit her, which you yourself delivered into my hands. He tossed the letter onto the table. Garrick stared at it, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Lady Beaumont leaned forward, her eyes glittering. Forgery, you say, Your Grace? A most serious accusation. One I am prepared to prove, the Duke said. But it is not the most significant piece of evidence we have today. Miss Ingram? He turned to Constance. This was her moment. She stepped forward, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos erupting in the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She opened her portfolio. Your Grace, Lady Beaumont, gentlemen, for 500 years, the families of Little Barton have held their cottages not as tenants, but as stewards, she began, her voice clear and steady. They have paid their rent not in coin, but in labor, specifically the sacred duty of maintaining the river weir and banks, which protects the entire valley from flooding. She paused, letting the words sink in. A duty which, according to the vicar's own records, they have performed without fail, year after year, generation after generation. Nonsense, Garrick spluttered. There is no such agreement. On the contrary, Mr. Garrick, Constance said, her eyes locking onto his. There is, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, she unrolled the ancient parchment. This is the Barton Charter, signed by John, 4th Duke of Kestrel Chase, in the year 1485. It grants, in perpetuity, the cottages and a garden plot to the families of Barton in exchange for their service to the river. It is a binding, legal document. She held it up for all to see. The effect was electric. A wave of murmurs turned into a roar of elation from the tenants. Lady Beaumont took the charter, her expert eyes scanning the text. After a long moment, she looked up, first at Garrick, then at the Duke. This document is authentic, she declared, her voice ringing with authority. The land belongs to them. The hall erupted. Garrick crumpled into his chair, a ruined man. Lady Farrow sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, publicly attached to a fraud and a fool. The tenants were weeping, cheering, embracing one another. But Constance only looked at the Duke. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, for the first time, she saw not a duke, not a soldier, not a ghost, but a man seeing his own salvation. That evening, Kestrel Chase was quiet. Garrick was gone, dismissed and facing the magistrate's justice.
Lady Pharaoh had fled back to her own home in a storm of humiliated fury. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its stone walls holding a new, lighter silence. Constance was in the library, the fire casting a warm, dancing glow on the newly ordered shelves. She was running her hand over the smooth, worn leather of a book when he found her. Duncan did not speak at first. He simply came and stood before her, his presence filling the space between them. The air was charged with everything that had not been said. "My father," Constance said quietly, not looking at him, "believed that a library was a conversation between the past and the future. For so long, this room has been silent." "You have given it back its voice," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "You have given this whole house back its voice." He took a step closer. "I was living in a ruin, Miss Ingram, a fortress of my own making. I believed in nothing but loss and betrayal. I trusted no one." He reached out and took her hands. They were not soft, aristocratic hands. They were capable, clever hands that had sifted through lies to find the truth. "You did not shout or weep or plead," he said, his gaze intense. "You showed me the evidence. You trusted me to see it." "I trusted the truth," she corrected softly. "You, Your Grace, were the one who had to choose to see it." "Duncan," he said. The use of his given name was a shock, an intimacy that made her breath catch. "My name is Duncan." He knelt then, before her, on the library floor, the great Duke of Kestrel Chase, before the woman everyone had called plain and unremarkable. It was not an act of submission. It was an act of profound respect. "Constance," he said, her own name a vow on his lips. "I am asking. Answer plainly. I have no right to, but I am asking you to stay. Not as a clerk, not as a guest, as the Duchess of this house, as my wife,
As my partner, help me rebuild this life. Together." He did not speak of love, not in the flowery language of poets. He spoke of partnership, of rebuilding, of a shared future. It was a language she understood perfectly. It was a language of truth. And looking down at this grim, guarded man who had finally chosen to see, she felt a love so deep and powerful, it was like a homecoming. "Yes," she whispered. "Plainly, yes." 1 year later, the gardens of Kestrel Chase were in full bloom. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the village, where the new schoolhouse, funded by the monies recovered from Garrick, was having its opening day. The house itself was filled with light and warmth, its corridors echoing with the quiet bustle of a happy, well-run home. Mrs. Holloway now smiled more than she frowned, and the library was the beating heart of the house once more. Constance, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, stood on the terrace with her husband. She was no longer the invisible woman in gray. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, the color of a summer sky. But the real change was in her eyes. They shone with a quiet, confident joy. Duncan came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He was no longer a ghost. The harsh lines on his face had softened, and he moved with the easy grace of a man at peace in his own home. He leaned his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers to the thriving village below. "They are planting an orchard by the river," he said. "In your honor." "It is in honor of the charter," she replied.
"It is in your honor," he insisted gently. "You reminded them of its existence. You reminded me of mine." Around her neck, on a simple silk ribbon, she wore the small wooden kestrel her father had carved. It had been her only treasure. Duncan's fingers found it, his touch gentle against the worn wood. "The patient hunter," he murmured, "who sees what others miss." She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to rest on his heart. It beat strong and steady beneath her palm. They had not had a whirlwind romance. Theirs was a love built on a foundation of evidence, of shared purpose, fighting, unwavering respect. It was a structure as strong and enduring as the ancient stones of the house around them. It was a truth they had chosen to see, together. And looking out at the land they would protect, at the home they had revived, Constance Ingram knew she had not just found a dusty charter in a forgotten box. She had found everything. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The story of the quiet clerk who had faced down a duke and saved a village became a local legend. But for Constance and Duncan, their life was a collection of smaller, more precious moments. It was in the way he would seek her out in the library at the end of the day, not always to speak, but simply to sit in the comfortable silence with her. It was in the way she learned the language of his moods, knowing when his past threatened to cast its long shadow, and knowing that a hand on his arm or a shared cup of tea was enough to call him back to the present. Her cousin Felicity, humbled by her mother's public disgrace, became a frequent visitor. The shallowness was still there, but it was tempered now with a genuine, if bewildered, affection for Constance. "I simply cannot understand it," she'd said one afternoon, watching Duncan cross the lawn to greet his wife with a rare, open smile. "He never even noticed me. And you never even tried." "That is perhaps the difference," Constance had replied gently. "I was not trying to be noticed. I was trying to do my work." This simple statement seemed to hold for Felicity a universe of baffling wisdom. The sharp-tongued Lady Beaumont became a firm ally and a friend. She would visit for dinner, and her conversations with the Duke were a formidable clash of intellects, which he clearly enjoyed.
But her softest words were always for Constance. "You, my dear, are proof that a well-organized mind is a woman's most potent weapon," she said, raising a glass of sherry. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The redemption of Lady Farrow was a more complicated matter. She never apologized, for that was not in her nature. But a year after the confrontation, a small anonymous donation arrived for the village school, a sum that was, to the shilling, the amount Constance's father had unwisely invested with Lady Farrow's late husband and lost. It was not an apology, but it was an accounting, a debt quietly repaid. Constance accepted it as such and never spoke of it again. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after their marriage, Duncan found Constance in the estate office. She was not working on ledgers, but was carefully pressing late-blooming flowers between sheets of wax paper. She had brought life back to every corner of Kestrel Chase, even this small, once chilly room. He came and stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "I have a gift for you," he said. He laid a long, flat, velvet-wrapped object on the desk. She carefully unwrapped it. It was a frame, beautifully made from the wood of a fallen Kestrel Chase oak. And inside, mounted on rich blue velvet, was the Barton Charter. It had been professionally preserved,
its delicate parchment now safe behind glass. "It belongs here," he said, "where you found it. To remind us. To remind us of the truth," she finished for him, her voice soft. "Yes, and to remind me," he said, turning her to face him, "that the greatest treasure in this house was not a document in a box, but the woman who had the courage to find it." He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss filled with the quiet certainty of their shared life. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding love. The love of two people who had found each other in the ruins and built something strong and beautiful and true. Later, they would walk down to the village to see the new orchard. They would stand on the banks of the river, the same river whose stewardship had saved a community, and they would watch the setting sun paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. And the small wooden kestrel, resting against Constance's heart, would be warmed by the heat of her skin, a silent testament to the patient hunter who had seen the truth, and in doing so, had found her home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.